This program tonight is really going to be special for me personally. I happen to be friends with all three of those who will be on stage, and having moved here to Silicon Valley in 1976, I have a feeling for a major portion of Margaret's book, but not all of it. And it's a wonderful read if you want to dig a little deeper than pre-1976. And I can tell from those that I've met here tonight already that many of you both were here then, but also many of you actually made that history happen. So this is going to be a special program, and I can't thank you all enough for coming, and I can't thank our panelists tonight for their work and dedication to bringing this story together, because it's important, especially today, given what's going on in the world, to understand the public-private partnership which made this valley what it is. And there's a lot to be said about that you'll hear tonight. So with that, I'm going to introduce Marguerite Gong-Hancock, who is the founding executive director of our Exponential Center, which is a section of the museum that is fundamental to understanding the explosive growth that this valley has created as a result of technology. So Marguerite's been here for 3 years running the program, and I'm going to let her kick things off. So thanks, Marguerite.
Thanks so much. Thanks very much, Daniel, and I'm adding my warm welcome to you tonight. Tonight's conversation is focused around the ideas of this new book by Margaret O'Mara, The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. I think it's a compelling and carefully researched book that really looks at tech, politics, and the larger cultural context and how it's evolved over time, an important set of topics for all of us today. And for this conversation, what better than to bring three leading lights in this area who can help illuminate the topics. And as is our tradition, I'd like to introduce each of them through 5 numbers. First, Margaret O'Mara. She's a professor of history at the University of Washington, and she writes and teaches about US history and politics. I first met Margaret a handful of years ago when she started on this project, and it's a particular delight to feature her on stage. 5 is the number of years with Bill Clinton's campaign and presidential administration. 2000, the year she began writing about Silicon Valley. 2,500, the number of students she's taught at Stanford and the University of Washington. 3, the number of books published. And last but not least, 774 endnotes in the code. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Margaret O'Mara. Next, Tom Khalil. Tom is Chief Innovation Officer of Schmidt Futures and an entrepreneur in residence at UC Berkeley. He designed and launched national technology initiatives under 2 administrations, both for Presidents Clinton and Obama. And in the code, he describes showing a web browser to Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton's economic advisor, for the first time. Rubin asked, "Who owns this?" And here are 5 numbers for Tom. 2, as I mentioned, the presidents he served under, both Clinton and Obama. 16 years worked at White House. 27 billion, the amount of research funding provided by the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which he founded. And 7,000, the number of students from Berkeley and other universities whose ideas have been supported by Big Ideas, which he started. Too many, the number of books he owns. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Tom. Great to have you here, Tom. Thanks so much. And last but certainly not least, our moderator, veteran tech journalist and a longtime friend and collaborator here at the museum, John Markoff. He returns to the museum to guide this conversation. Here are his 5 numbers. 3,000 plus the number of tech articles he's written for the New York Times. 1993, the year he wrote the first ever piece on the World Wide Web. 42 years, 42, the number of years he spent writing on technology and science for the Pacific News Service, San Jose Mercury News, and the New York Times. 5, the number of books he's written on the history of people and the relationship with computers. And last but not least, 4, the number of Pulitzer Prize nominations he received before winning in 2013. John, it's wonderful to have you back here at the museum.
Evening, everyone. So you all have cards, so I want to get you in as we go on. So please, if you have questions, ask them. And we're going to spend most of the evening talking about the code and the world that it describes. But here I have two people who are veterans of the Clinton White House, and I really want to start there. Did you guys know each other?
Yeah.
We did.
Did you work together?
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. We met in the late months of 1992 during the transition after Clinton and Gore had been elected in Little Rock, working on the economic conference, I think.
So the economic summit, we didn't sleep for a while because all of the higher ups had spent all this time figuring out who was going to be there, and no one had spent any time about like what the substance was or who was actually going to talk. So I remember like calling these Nobel laureates up very late at night saying, oh, do you mind coming down to Little Rock? So it was a really interesting experience.
And did you come directly off the campaign to the White House?
Yeah.
And what has your role been in the campaign?
Oh, me?
All of the above? Or?
All of the above. Well, no, I started where every good political career starts. I started in the mailroom, working in the correspondence office, operating the auto pen and writing letters, back when people wrote letters to candidates instead of emails. It was before email. And then ended up working on the economic policy staff, which is where I met Tom. And then I ended up in the White House. You know, the funny thing about politics is Washington, D.C. runs on very young people who are willing to work really hard and not get paid very much. And so I was there kind of sitting crouching in the corner watching history be made. And it was extraordinary. It was really extraordinary.
And when you came into the White House, what was your you came in to do what?
I came in as the assistant to one of the economic policy directors, okay. Yeah. And then I quickly, soon, a few months later, I moved out of the White House, went down the road to Health and Human Services to work on one of the major things that the Clinton administration was consumed with that year, which was healthcare reform.
Yeah.
So funnily enough, I didn't work on tech policy. And thank God people like Tom were there working, and you were working on not just tech policy, but thinking about tech policy as economic policy. Mm-hmm. I mean, really that intersection. And that's the really striking thing about the 1990s, and something that was really reinforced to me as I researched and wrote this book was that this is a moment when the infrastructure of the digital revolution, of the online revolution, is being laid down, where people from the Valley are working with lawmakers of both parties to figure out what the rules of the road are going to be, and how you foster this, which Capra called the Jeffersonian internet. And at the same time, there's certain things the government had to do to create this infrastructure, and that was what you were working on. And I was down the hall working on things like healthcare and welfare and urban policy and thinking, well, that's the most important thing. And then down, on the other side of the building, Tom's there building the future, along with all of you guys.
Did you come out of the Semiconductor Industry Association directly to the White House?
I worked for a firm that represented the semiconductor industry. So I got to staff Gordon Moore, who was chairman of the SIA Technology Committee, and Bob Noyce, who was CEO of Semitech. That was going on when we were having this big debate about US-Japan competition. And I still remember the talks that Andy Grove used to give. So he had a series of slides that had US market share declining and rest of the world, e.g. Japan, market share increasing. And the only thing that was different about the charts was what year the crossover point. And then the denouement was flat panel displays where Japan had 100% and the US had 0. And he said in this Hungarian accent, and this is the flat line of the EKG. And so you can imagine that you're like an impressionable 20-something, you're like, oh my God, we got to do something about this.
So you guys get to the White House, go back, how many years is it to 92? Go back to 92 to 93. What did Silicon Valley look like to you guys then? You had been coming into the Valley by that time.
I'd been meeting with Intel and AMD and Texas Instruments and Motorola, and so I would say at that time the industry was not just Silicon Valley. So you had both the companies like IBM and DEC and HP that both made computers, but also sold chips sometimes just for their own internal consumption. And then what were called at that time the merchants, that is the companies like Intel and Advanced Micro Devices and LSI Logic and things like that.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that when I was working with them, despite the fact that the CEOs were all Republicans, they were sort of unhappy with the Bush administration. And that's because they thought that their industry was really important, and you'll be shocked to learn. There was this quote, which may or may not be apocryphal, from one of the Bush economic officials, which was, "Computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference?" That is, $1 of GDP is $1 of GDP. And they were like, what? And then Andy Grove sent Michael Boskin a violin for being like Nero and fiddling while Rome burnt. And the other thing that happened is, that people like John Young, who features prominently in your book, he had been asked by Ronald Reagan to set up this commission on industrial competitiveness. And it became clear to him that he was just being used as window dressing, and that the administration had no intention of following through on any of the recommendations that he developed. So that is why there was a group of people in the tech industry who had never voted for a Democrat for dog catcher in their life, who were gettable in '92.
I want to come back to that. I want to come back to industrial policy, but let's come to it through the code.
Yeah.
Can we start? Tell me the backstory. Why did you write this book? What led you to the code?
Well, I've been looking at the history of Silicon Valley for, since the dot-com era now. And the whole time people kept on asking me, what was the magic? How did Silicon Valley do it? And with the subtext, how can we build one of ours too? And so I wrote this book to answer those questions. I also wrote this book because we have biographies of iconic business leaders, we have biographies of companies, heck, we got biographies of presidents, but we don't have a biography of Silicon Valley, and that's what this is.
Okay. And there's already a rich literature, and it's kind of, I'm finding the history of Silicon Valley is kind of a Rashomon kind of thing, or maybe it's Blind Men and the Elephant. We had an event here not long ago, a private event here at the Computer History Museum with a guy who's writing a history of Silicon Valley, who's seeing it all through the prism of the venture capitalists. And his view is venture capital was essential and everything else was not essential.
Yeah.
So,
Shocking.
All the venture capitalists in the room are nodding. Yep.
So place yourself.
No Bucks, no Buck Rogers.
Place yourself in that, in that literature. What wrongs were you trying to right?
Yeah, well, I wanted to show interconnections and how it's all connected. The way I describe the valley in the book is it's an entrepreneurial Galapagos, which is a place that develops in some isolation with very distinctive species, not only of entrepreneurs, but also of venture capitalists, of law firms, marketing firms.
Research universities?
Research universities, yes, there is no research university quite like Stanford, right? It is.
Berkeley.
Except Berkeley. No, but here's the difference between Stanford and Berkeley. It's public and private. So Stanford did in what Fred Terman, with, I should add, President Wallace Stirling, a historian, did in the 40s and the 50s to Stanford, was to, the steeples of excellence, remake the entire operation, remake the whole org, build out physics, build out all these labs. And to do that, then you shrink other things.
Yeah.
A public university like the University of California or the University of Washington cannot and should not do that. You kind of need to have a French department.
But somebody recently told me what percentage of Berkeley's budget is public, and do you know, Tom? It's not. You've been there. It's not a big portion. It's pretty privatized, isn't it?
Yeah. No, the level of funding from the state is a tiny fraction of what.
Which stunned me, actually.
Of what it used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is another really important part of the story. This is very much a California story. So in that way, the University of California and California's K-12 education system in the 50s and 60s and 70s is part of the story. It's this infrastructure, educational infrastructure, that allows, it's this escalator of upward mobility for all these kids. And that is something that is no longer the case. I mean, the public universities like Berkeley, like mine, the line item of state funding is very small.
Did you start, you were a Stanford professor, you're now at University of Washington. Did you start this at Stanford? Where were you when you actually started the project?
Well, I started this particular book at a return visit to Stanford. I think I started the larger kind of life project of understanding Silicon Valley's and writing Silicon Valley's history when my first tour of duty at Stanford, which was straight out of graduate school. During graduate school, I was writing a dissertation down here, and straight out of graduate school, I was a postdoc at Stanford and then an assistant professor, and then moved up to Seattle and to the University of Washington, and started this book 5 years ago when I had a sabbatical term and I came down to the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, which is just up the hill from Stanford, part of Stanford, and had this amazing year in which I had, so rare, it's so rare to have time to think and space to think and actually get paid for it. And this is one of those few institutions that allows you to do that. I felt incredibly lucky that I had the time to take my time doing this book, time to talk to a lot of people and a lot of different people, and to see as the history of Silicon Valley today unfurled around me. And the book really reflects that. It's the product of work from 2014 to 2019. And it has been shaped by all the things that have happened.
I wanted to ask you about your audience, or the audience in your mind. I mean, as you can tell from this crowd, it's going to reach a popular audience.
Yeah.
But are you also having a conversation with your professional colleagues? I mean, are there issues in the book that speak directly to a more narrow professional audience?
I think there are. I mean, my main audience is the larger audience, and particularly an audience of people who, like me, when I came to this subject 20 years ago, were not technical people, didn't know much about the history of computing. Again, while Tom Khalil was building the future, I was down the hall working on important things, but very different things. But I also am trying to connect the story of Silicon Valley to the larger narrative of the grand narrative of modern American history, of political history, of social history and activism, and the things that are in the textbooks. The way that the textbooks are written, or the way that we historians who aren't historians of technology write about modern America is, here's the grand march of industry and of social change and of political change, and then off to the side are those wacky long-haired guys doing their digital thing. And part of it is because most historians who don't specialize in this topic are not expert. They are like me. They don't know the history of computing. They don't know a lot of the history that's contained within the walls of this museum, and the history that is contained in the lives of so many people in this audience today, and people listening and watching online and in other ways. But it is a product. Silicon Valley is a product of modern American history. It is made possible by World War II, the Cold War, the space race. And in turn, it has reshaped and is reshaping American history. The textbooks 100 years from now are going to have a big section on today's Silicon Valley moguls in the way that they now have a section on Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and have sections on tech as a transformative, socially, economically, politically transformative sector. So let's bring it back into the center of the story.
Yeah. The 5 years, it's an interesting period that you worked on this book, because there was this moment in 2016 that seems very important to me, where the zeitgeist shifted, where Silicon Valley went from being able to do no wrong to being able to do no right, which is where we are today, it seems.
Yeah.
And how did that affect you?
Gosh, it was wild, John. It really was, because I started off this book with a time when people were saying with little irony or inflection, not only in the Valley but elsewhere, tech is going to change the world. This is all good. It's good. And and the Obama administration was very much very closely tied in to folks here and thinking very concertedly about how can we use these technological tools in a way to improve the work of government and to affect social change. And then in the course now, the mood has gotten so dark, with really the 2016 being this turning point, that I've gone from being the person who 5 years ago was piping up saying, well, you know, there might have been some politics involved, or maybe the government had something to do with it, or maybe, do you remember the Cold War? And now I'm like, there's a supercomputer on my wrist. Like, there's awesome stuff that comes out of this place. How do we celebrate the innovation, the entrepreneurship, the incredible flywheel of sort of multi-generational creation that's happened in this place and in other high-tech places and in the place where I live, Seattle. And also, you know, recognize where the blind spots have been, where it has gone off the rails, where these creations have become like Frankenstein's monster. They've gotten, you know, and how do we recognize that, hey, what's born and bred here is now being exported, these products are being exported around the world, and they don't always translate very well in other geographies, and they can be extremely disruptive and very dangerous in other places. So it's been a strange time, but it does make me feel like now more than ever is really important to look and understand how we got to right now.
I wanted to ask you about methodology. And I was thinking when reading your book about sort of what I do and what you do, and you've started to do what I do recently. You're writing regularly for the New York Times these days. You have both primary source material and secondary source material in your book. Talk to me a little bit about your methodology.
Well, in some ways, I had to build my own archive because this is, you know, you're building the airplane while in flight. The tech industry is often looking forward and not always thinking about, you know, we should conserve this history. I think the earlier generations, the pioneer generations of the Valley, the people who came here in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, have recognized, including, you know, through this institution, have recognized that this is a history that needs to be preserved and conserved. I was thanking just to the high heavens again and again Pete Bancroft and the Venture Capitalist Oral History Project, that, you know, the creation of this incredible body of work that's now housed at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, but also available online, and also the oral histories, the many oral histories that Computer History Museum has assembled over time of entrepreneurs, of technologists in the Valley, and then being able to interview people myself and to help build my own oral history repository. Journalists, first draft of history, thank you, John Markoff. I mean, honestly, that you were one of the very few people that you were not, you know, the Times didn't have a tech reporter. You weren't, you know, you were kind of the beginning, right?
Well,
you were the science
Andy Pollack
reporter.
was before me, but I was the second one, yes.
Yes, but it was the beginning. So having, you know, looking at the journalism of the people who were following the story early was very important. The books written by journalists, some of them have held up very, very well and were extremely useful to me. So, and then I would, you know, meet with people, including some people who are in this room, and they would just hand me a file folder and say, I saved this. Oh. I don't know if you have any use for it. And I'd open it and be like, thank you.
Let's stop for a second here. Could people who are in the book or know who they're in the book, could you raise your hands? I know a bunch of you are here. Looks like there's about 10 people here who are in the book?
Yeah, I see, yay.
I recognize many faces, neat. Yeah.
So, and that is, you know, that's living history. I mean, this is a history that is still being written, and it, you know, it underscores the need for thinking about what the Silicon Valley, the archive of Silicon Valley writ large, and the archive of tech looks like.
Do you ever think, God, it'd be much easier if these people were all dead? I hate to
I did. Well, I'll confess that there were times when I was writing the book, and you know what really happened? It was less the folks who were the sort of earlier generations. It was more trying to write about right now, and then kind of getting up in the morning, opening the Times and being like, ugh, I have to revise this chapter, you know, Facebook did this. News kept on being made, and so that was the time when I was like, I wish I was writing about Ulysses S. Grant, because then it would just, you know, stop.
This is a question for both of you. I got the sense that you're trying to dial things over and have a sense that you were sort of doing combat with this view of the world that Silicon Valley happened in a vacuum and there was no infrastructure around it, and that you wanted to sort of correct that record. Mm-hmm. There was another recent, well, not that recent, but there is another, I think she's European, Mariana Mazzucato, who has this book called The Enterprise State, which sort of dials all the way over to it's all government. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and I think the iPhone is the classic example. She takes a technology, and this technology wouldn't exist if this government spending. Where do you fit on that spectrum? And then let me ask Tom,
All right.
not you, but with Tom about that issue.
It's not entirely entrepreneurship, it's not entirely government, it's both. And that's the really critical thing to understand and the critical part of the story. And the only in America story, quite frankly. Because what happens in the Valley, starting significantly with the Cold War, you know, what turns this from being the nation's capital of prune production to being this? It is World War II and the Cold War and this tsunami of federal money, military and otherwise, that washes over the Pacific West. But it wasn't big government spending, you know, let's build a giant lab, although that happened too. It was a lot of money washing into the labs at Stanford and washing into Lockheed Missiles and Space and into private industry. So the government puts money.
And Berkeley.
And Berkeley. Yes. We're going to have get in a sort of, it's going to be the big game on stage. But it washes in, and then government gets out of the way. It's a lot of government spending, but it is done in a way that provides this platform, this foundation for entrepreneurial startups to start competing ferociously with one another for contracts for the Apollo program, for for some of this money.
Is it the neither one or the other sort of aspect of your argument that is the thing that distinguishes Silicon Valley? Is that the special sauce?
I think it distinguishes Silicon Valley and it distinguishes America. When we think about Silicon, every place around the world wants to build a Silicon something. And America, I would add, in particularly the golden quarter century after the end of World War II. The United States at a time of extraordinary economic growth, of public investment, and without meaningful international competition, where the major industrial competition was literally in rubble after the end of World War II. So linking it into that story, and again, this is not to say that you don't have extraordinary stories of brilliant entrepreneurship and these iconoclastic figures. There's a reason that my book's cover has the pictures of the guys who need no introduction, most of whose names are famous. But what they are able to do is made possible not only by a larger community of people, both technological and non, and other companies, a larger ecosystem, but also the larger historical context in which they're coming up.
Tom, where do you come down?
I would have added Licklider to the cover.
All right. It's in there.
Where do you come down on this spectrum?
So I think that if you look at a lot of the technological building blocks that are driving the industry, whether it was the internet, which the government started investing in 1969, the first graphical web browser, which Mark Andreessen developed when he was an undergraduate at NCSA, the FinFET, which is the latest transistor that all the semiconductor companies are using, electronic design automation, the work on CDMA that was the basis for Qualcomm, GPS, the decades of work that DARPA put into speech recognition before we had anything that was useful. That a lot of that technology, if you said, where did it come from? There is this long period of early support and incubation that comes from agencies like DARPA and the National Science Foundation. And then industry has to figure out how to commercialize it, how to turn it into a product or service that people want to buy, and has to invest more than the government does by several orders of magnitude. So I don't think you want to say it's all government, as Margaret said. I don't think you want to say it's all government or it's all venture capital on Sand Hill Road. You have to look at the relationship. Mm-hmm. And yeah. I think one of the things that I was struck by was, by the time industry would be talking about something. So a classic example was the Internet of Things, right? So, if you think about when industry started talking about that, and I remember in the 1990s when DARPA was funding. Now, they had a boring name for it. It was like wireless sensor networks, right? Yeah. So it was not like a snazzy marketing term. But I remember going to the DARPA summer studies in the 90s and talking to Deborah Estrin, who was at UCLA, and Chris Piester, who was working on Smart Dust, and David Culler, who was working on TinyOS, which is the operating system that you could run on that. And that was in the mid and late 90s. And then, so I just saw over and over again that the technology that industry was excited about commercializing, that I had been talking to my colleagues within the government, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So layer culture on top of this. I mean, one of the things that was sort of news to me in reading your book that I found really interesting was the importance of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. Could you take us through that and make your argument for this group?
Yeah, well, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Bill, is the act that ends the quota system that had been in place since the early 1920s, which had been put in place, quite frankly, for racist and nationalistic and prejudicial reasons. It was to keep all those Southern and Eastern Europeans, many of them Jewish and Catholic, out from coming to the country in such great numbers. There was a vigorous debate about immigration and its effects, and also its political dangers. This was, of course, a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 20s. There was worries that socialism would come along with the immigrants. So this regime stays in place for a long time. In 1965, the Immigration Reform Act is kind of understood and pitched by Lyndon Johnson as a kind of crossing the T's and dotting the I's on civil rights. Like, America is a land of fairness and equity. We should not have this immigration system that is clearly prejudicial. And as he's signing it into law in October 1965 on Liberty Island, great optics, he says, this is not a revolutionary bill. He's mostly trying to calm down his Southern Democratic segregationist colleagues who don't like the idea of new immigrants coming from other places. And is really trying to, but no one saw it coming. And what it does, it becomes, I think, pretty much one of the biggest pieces of economic policy in America history in the last 60 years, because it opens the doors to people from around the world, huge new waves of immigration, and you see it no clearer than here in Silicon Valley, where immigrants particularly from East and South Asia, come in great numbers and disproportionately found companies. Their children found companies. It's immigrants and refugees, and many of them are already educated, already technical people who are coming here to be part of the tech community. But a lot of them are people who, as they're crossing the border for the first time, aren't obviously destined to be, the next tech innovator or be the parent of one. And so that free movement of people and capital has been really critical to the American story. And immigrants have gotten the job done in Silicon Valley for most of its history.
Like all of the graduates of the IITs would be a good example.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you mean who came here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like a pipeline. As a matter of fact, I had this really sort of transformational moment in 1984. I was working at Byte magazine, and my friend took me down to this Indian bakery in Sunnyvale. What was an Indian bakery? I mean, India as in India, bakery in Sunnyvale. And it was because there were so many disk drive engineers that the community had begun to form. And that was when I first got this sense that it's about multiculturalism in a big way.
And it was transformative to the Valley, because before that, the Valley was, not very racially diverse at all. And although there have been, foreign war people, Andy Grove being one of them, again, teenage refugee, like not someone that immediately, the immigration officer might not have immediately thought of him as the next, the sort of iconic future CEO. And so that, that is the other thing. This isn't only an American story, but this doesn't mean that American-born people are necessarily better at technology. It's that the United States in the later half of the 20th century was a destination point for technical superstars from around the world.
So you have immigration reform. You have these changes in investment policy that make it easier to do venture investment.
Yes.
You have
the change of the prudent man standard.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which happened when there was also
78, yeah.
Yeah. You also had the mandatory free licensing of the semiconductor. That was much earlier, but that was the kind of fact. And then you had this serendipitous stuff like the fact that Shockley's mother lived in Palo Alto.
Yeah.
So how do you...
Fred Terman's very persuasive. I think he kind of did a sales job on it.
To bring Shockley here.
But yeah, his mother lived and she was ailing and he was good.
So separate out these forcing functions where you have these unexpected consequences from these serendipitous events. I mean, I'm trying to get your view of the chemistry that brought Silicon Valley into
brought it together. Well, you know, Shockley wasn't entirely serendipity. It was partially, you know, there was this, you know, Terman comes back from his wartime service in Cambridge working on war work as under Vannevar Bush, his graduate advisor, realizing that here is Stanford's great opportunity. I mean, he writes this letter to a colleague in the middle of the war saying Stanford could rise up the ranks and be like Harvard, be a consequential world-class university, or it could just be like Dartmouth, which is well respected but not that important. sick burn by Terman. Now, I think many Dartmouth alumni would, you know, Dartmouth itself very important in the history of computing, but we'll put that to one side. But he comes back with a mission, and so by the time Shockley arrives, you have Stanford building up its microwaves electronics lab. You have the transformation of Stanford underway. Stanford's built its research park that is, you know, designed to sort of this place to get East Coast electronics companies to open West Coast labs in proximity to Stanford. You have Lockheed that's located Missiles in Space in Sunnyvale. So you have these two hubs. You have, you know, Hewlett-Packard, students of Terman, who are, you know, they go public in '57. They're you know, they're definitely a booming company. You have Varian, you have these other pioneering companies, some of which predate World War II. But they really, you know, the flywheel is going because of this Cold War spending. So Shockley comes into this, and yeah, there's, you know, look, he'd alienated everyone at Bell Labs and on the East Coast, so he comes far away, comes home. But Terman is also, you know, there's a lot of reason to come here, and it's also, you know, makes it a better sell for the traitorous eight to, you know, the weather's nice and there's other stuff going on. It wasn't that they were coming out to a fruit orchard. There was quite a bit happening even by 1955, 56.
There's an element to your book that's structural that I wanted to ask about. You have these little pauses throughout your book that are called arrivals. Mm-hmm. And I thought they were very nice. And I also sort of I wanted to know, you know, what was the subtext there? What were you saying in painting these portraits?
Well, one of the things that struck me, I realized early on in the book, especially as I started interviewing people, some of whom are now in their retirement in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and they all had come to the Valley as young people, or they'd enter the technology industry as young people. And we think of tech now as a very young people's game. You know, you have people dropping out of their sophomore year in college and starting companies. You have young, you know, people in their 20s. And it's always been a place of people arriving in their 20s again and again. But I also did it because I wanted to show that this is the human stories behind the big story. That not only is it not just the people you've heard of, it's some people you haven't heard of. I wanted to showcase people who were unsung heroes. I wanted to talk about people who were very important to making the Valley go, that names might not, you know, someone outside this community might not know, and including people who are working in Silicon Valley now might not have heard of. I wanted to showcase the role of women and technical women in technology throughout the whole history of the Valley.
How did you find Ann Hardy in particular?
How did I find out?
Who's here, by the way?
There's Ann Hardy. I'm looking at her right now. Ann Hardy is if my book does anything, I hope it brings Ann Hardy to the forefront, and that there's a big Hollywood biopic on her sometime soon. She has an extraordinary story and is a classic example of a technical woman, a technical superstar who, first of all, doesn't come in with a fancy engineering degree, because in the early 1950s when she graduated college, she was not allowed to major in any of those majors. She instead majored in phys ed because that was the closest she could get to get some science and some math in. And then she ends up walking into IBM and taking a programming job. And women programmers, of course, are part of the story in great numbers in the early years of computing. And in fact, software programming, one of the reasons so many women were able to do it was because it was not seen as the complicated part of computing. You know, building the machines was the really complicated part. The art and the science was there. And anyone who's a programmer or developer in the room was like, that's what? No, it's extremely, so as soon as they started, you start doing it, you realize, oh, this is very complicated. And there is a lot. But there is, instances of, but to sort of keeping on as a technical woman in the industry over time. First of all, particularly if you wanted to rise up the ranks and become a manager or an executive, as Anne did, you had to put up with a lot of stuff. It was part of the culture and part of the magic has been the fact that it's a work hard, play hard place. There's a lot of fun that goes on in the industry. There's a lot, but particularly in the early years when this was a small place, when you had like 1 or 2 bars you could go to, everyone's living together, everyone's socializing together, everyone's working together all the time, and it's a hard-charging, incredibly competitive atmosphere. To get ahead in the semiconductor industry, your elbows had to be sharpened at all times as a company because you're fighting for survival. And that becomes an inhospitable place for people who are trying to raise a family, who may not easily fit into or be welcome at all of the after-hours social events. And this helps us, one of the things I wanted to unwind and untangle in this book and help explain, there's been this really, this ongoing conversation about diversity in the industry in the last few years that really hadn't ever happened before. So if nothing else, we're talking about it, and that's different.
Yeah.
But to understand what to do about it and to understand why it is a challenging thing to solve is to kind of unwind and let's go back and look at the history. Not a history where someone says, let's make sure that no one gets to be in our clubhouse, but one in which this belief in meritocracy and a kind of putting a premium on an engineering talent and technical talent could often be blind to the fact that there were a whole host of people who weren't allowed to get that expertise in the first place.
Yeah. I want to go back to one of the things that Tom said. You're talking about the pre-competitive point where government research is super important. It's fallen off the radar now, but there used to be a heated sort of intellectual or historical debate about the role that the space program or the ICBM played in the development of the integrated circuit. Do you remember there was was it the space program? Was it the ICBM? Where did the integrated circuit come from? Do either of you guys have any sense of the forcing functions that led to the integrated circuits?
So this is a very dangerous question to ask in front of this audience because there are probably about 25 people in here who would be like, stand up and be like, well, actually. Tom, you want to take it to you?
No, I mean, I just know that there were a lot of instances in which the government, whether it was the NASA space program or some of the Navy and Air Force programs, were buying integrated circuits when they were very, very expensive. And that's what enabled them to go down the learning curve so that eventually that you could put in a transistor radio. And Ken Flam, who I believe is now at UT Austin, did a really good job of going and getting some of the price data, and you can show how much the government was paying and then the role that the sort of a purchaser who is not particularly price sensitive, if you're responsible for running the Minuteman missile program, you're not going to be too concerned over what the price of your integrated circuit is. So I think the government played a really important role as an early user.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got one of the people that I talked to for the book was the late Bill Miller, Stanford computer science, Stanford, longtime Stanford faculty member. And he sort of framed it for me sort of at a very early stage of my research in such a wonderful way, sort of talking about how NASA created this foundation, this platform, kind of this guaranteed deep-pocketed customer that you could rely upon, that gave this latitude for these small companies, and also to build very small, sophisticated electronics. You didn't have to have a giant, didn't have to have a giant operation. You could still be kind of a relatively small to medium-sized company and have that sort of production. And so it created this platform and kind of this safety net of sorts. I don't know if quite those are the words he used, but to allow these small firms, and because it was also new, because the IC was so new, you didn't have, and this was at the same time that Bob McNamara is trying to like streamline and introduce efficiency into the government contracting procurement program. So, that's the end of prime contracting. It's an open, the guys who used to be guaranteed contracts aren't getting it anymore. So it creates this space for, again, entrepreneurial competition, and for these companies that are not founded to be defense contractors, to kind of create this platform for their eventual commercial growth. And one of those is, talk about serendipity. Fairchild Semiconductor, they incorporate, roughly speaking, a couple weeks before Sputnik rockets into space, October 4th, 1957. And then, Sputnik goes into space. Washington's collective hair is on fire, not only about, because it wasn't just space. I mean, the thing that is sometimes forgotten, we think about astronauts and the right stuff. This was all part of the Cold War, that missiles and rockets were the same technology, which of course, that was, up and down the West Coast, you have lots of defense hubs. You have my town of Seattle building big airplanes. You have LA building a lot of big airplanes too. And here, already in the 50s, you're building small. You're bringing small electronics. And so when the ramp up in space spending happens after 57, the place that builds small all of a sudden has access to this new fire hose of money that's coming. And that is, again, the public and the private working together. Bob Noyce and the Trader Estate were not like, we're going to be the next Lockheed. They're building a silicon semiconductor company. They're thinking, they're business people. But they were incredibly lucky in their timing, because the IC that was developed there is, it's
But then
all the
eventually
rockets.
what happens is that the military becomes like 1 to 2% of the market.
Yeah.
And the semiconductor companies don't really care about the government as an end user. And the problem that the government has is not the problem that Secretary Carter, for example, when he was Secretary of Defense, spent a lot of time on working on was no longer spin off. How does something move from defense to civilian, but spin on? How does the government become a more attractive customer so that startups will be interested in working with the Defense Department?
Yeah, because again, also working with the Defense Department was no picnic. It was also, procurement. I had a lot of people talk to me about, grudges about the procurement process of the mid-1970s.
On through to this day.
On through to this day, yeah.
So you didn't focus a lot on the world of electronic warfare, which was a subset of the defense world here.
Yeah.
Steve Blank, I think I saw him here.
Yes.
He's written an entire thesis about this.
Yeah.
I mean, was it just sort of in the noise, or because Bill Perry represented that faction of the Valley during the 70s? It was kind of a dominant sub-industry that drove microelectronics.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, part of this was, there were, quite frankly, there were so many amazing stories and strands of this place's history that I had to leave out or not talk about as much as I would like, or else everyone would be carrying around 1,200-page books and no one would buy my book. But part of the rationale was we have these. I was looking at also thinking about, this is a book that I want to reach people who are users of big tech products now, social media platform, the people who are outside the tech industry, who are touched by and both made, addicted to and made anxious by these products. And I wanted to trace back and see how we got to this big tech world. So that actually was one of the things that guided some of my narrative decisions as I moved through.
Which reminds me that this morning I saw you tweeted a GIF of Eric Bachman on a unicorn tossing off dollar bills. I thought it was very cute. That HBO series is one of my favorites. I mean, what kind of world are we in when the Valley is being mirrored as popular culture for the entire world?
Well,
and what do you think of that show? Now in its fifth season?
I know. I love that. It's funny that show came out in its early seasons. I just could not get enough of it. And what cracked me up is so many of my friends who were in the industry and in the Valley could not watch it. It was just too cringy. It was too close to some of their reality. But yeah, I mean, Silicon Valley is pop culture fodder, and which is so, for a long time it was off to the side, and now it is so central, but yet it is still misunderstood, and is also misunderstood by some of the people who are here working, building the future now, partially because there hasn't been a lot of interest in history. You know, you don't have to look very hard to find someone in today's tech who is saying, well, history's, you know, orthogonal to what I do. Why should I care about what happened in the past? Like, put a plaque on it and move on. Like, who cares? But
it wasn't popular culture when the industry was trying to figure out how they were going to get to a gigabit SRAM, and whether
why was that?
whether X-ray lithography was ever going to work or not.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's,
And now it feels like it's plumbing in a very sort of odd sense. I mean, the Valley has sort of moved on. You start the book with a series of questions. You pose a series of questions, and there's one in particular that jumped out at me. What you asked was, why didn't the people of this remarkable place understand the social potential of what they were creating and the darkly disruptive ways in which their products might be used? Mm-hmm. Do you think you have an answer to that question now?
I think I do, and it's not an easy answer. I joke that historians don't get asked on cable news very often because our answer is often, it's really complicated. That doesn't translate well.
Or it depends.
It depends. On the one hand, this. And, so, you know, some of the things that have made the magic here, the tightly networked community, the multi-generational network of tech, which is why venture capital is so very important to this story, because it's not just money, it's mentorship. It's picking the winners and nurturing the winners of the next generation, or who you hope will be winners. There is connective tissue that links the companies of right now to the companies to Shockley Semiconductor and Varian and HP, if you follow the money back and follow the mentorship back. And that has been a secret to why you have this incredible ability to pump out one generation of companies after another. Even though obituaries get written, they all seem to get written on the years that end in 9, like 69, oh, defense cutbacks, and 79, like, oh, the economy's bad, but then, ooh, personal computing. 89, 99, 2019, we're due. It's surprising. Not surprising everyone's so gloomy. But that incredible connection and this ecosystem, unlike any other, that's developed over time, because time is part of the ingredient, is also part of why it's hard to see where the blind spot, what your blind spots get bigger. It's hard to see outside the bubble, and particularly as wealth has grown larger. I mean, right now, the orders of magnitude of valuation and everything is just so much larger than even in the dot-com time. Even when we were working in Washington in the 90s, everything is just bigger. And because there are HBO shows devoted to the Valley, because the business section is devoted almost, 80%, 90% to tech, I mean, thank God you're no longer working full-time for the Times, because you would have to clone yourself.
I would be lost.
No.
The Times went all the way through the dot-com era with just me and a stringer, and now I think there are 23 people in the bureau. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary.
You did the work of 23 people.
Yeah. But that attests to how central
on a good
it
day.
is. Yeah. So it's so much bigger, that's why it makes the blind spots more problematic. The kind of the growth mentality, the thing that a seasoned VC would encourage a young entrepreneur to do. This is how you grow. This is how you're successful. This is what you need to deliver. This is what your mission and your goal should be. This is what your mantra should be. And now and coupled with the incredible power of the infrastructure that has been laid down over the last 25 years, the breakthroughs in computing, the fact that we now have such incredible power that you have it's the runaway train of the algorithm. And so it's not to let everyone off the hook and say, oh, they didn't realize what they were doing. But I understand and empathize. History makes you empathize or at least understand why people are doing what they're doing. And then if you understand that motivation and you understand how we got there, then you figure out how to unwind something. Yeah.
So you said early on that you're working for a lot of Republican CEOs. The Valley seems over the intervening quarter century to have dialed toward a more progressive stance. I mean, John Sculley was very visibly a Democrat for Clinton. Yeah. Where is the allegiance of the Valley now? Do you have a model, either of you?
Well, politically, I think they tried to be aggressively bipartisan in the sense that, for example, the organization that they created called TechNet said, we're going to have Democrats like John Doerr who will be responsible for interacting with the Clinton administration, and will have Republican CEOs who will deal with their Republican counterparts in the Hill. So I think that, from a political point of view, they've said we want to work with both parties. I think if you look at rank and file tech workers, particularly as a lot of the industry has moved to San Francisco, you see them being overwhelmingly Democratic, and B, putting a lot of pressure on their senior management about issues like, dealing with ICE or concerns about sexual harassment. And
Or AI.
AI.
Ethics around AI.
Yeah.
Do you have a view?
Well, and the parties, part of this is because the two national parties themselves change. So I talk in the book about what I label Silicon Valley republicanism, the republicanism of the great eminence of whom, with the grandfather, which was Dave Packard himself, who was really a very, a mentor, a fundor, a promoter of the careers of Republican politicians, particularly at the state and local level, and served in Richard Nixon's Defense Department as Deputy Secretary of Defense, was very politically engaged. But the republicanism of Silicon Valley was a moderate republicanism of which the National Republican Party started departing from. And from the people when I was talking to people who were part of that political world, they said, in the 90s when the Gingrich Congress came in and there was more sort of social conservatism and more kind of it sort of skewed in a different direction, that there was less, they felt a less strong identification, and that coupled with the potato chips of the Bush administration. But the other thing that changed was the Democratic Party changed. Another thing I trace in the book is how the Democratic Party, certain members, national Democrats, kind of identified the tech industries as the sunrise industries, as the great hope. They briefly were labeled the Atari Democrats, people like Tim Wirth and Gary Hart and Paul Tsongas. And what was so funny is I think for a long time, those Democrats really loved the Valley more than the Valley loved them back. There were sort of efforts of,
unrequited love.
Yeah, unrequited love. And then with Bill Clinton, who even before he announced his run for president, started coming out here. Larry Stone, who's here in the room today, helped facilitate a meeting between Clinton and some Silicon Valley execs very early on in '91, where Clinton comes in and charms the room and starts, these people who are either Republican leaning or just, not interested in party politics at all start, there's a connection that forms. And then during the Clinton years, the many different people from the Valley, including people who still identified as Republicans, are going to the White House, and they're being and they're being regularly frustrated by the bureaucracy that they encounter in DC. But they are really part of the political conversation, and we forget that there's a political backstory here. Right now, it seems like DC and Silicon Valley are colliding, and there actually has been this relationship over time, and that's part of what I wanted to uncover and unravel in the book, to show that because technologists also think, well, if the government just needs to get out of the way. And in certain cases, the government has gotten out of the way in critical ways with the encouragement and the lobbying of Valley executives. Happens in the late 70s when you have the NVCA, the venture capitalists, and the Electronics Association lobbying, guys going and working very hard to cut the capital gains, get the capital gains tax down, and the prudent man rule that was limiting risk capital investment, get that to go away. And then again in the 90s, when the rules of the road of the internet with the Communications Decency Act of '96 and Section 230, which we're all talking about today, that's something that was, the Valley was there at the, making the case that the internet should be free, and they should be held harmless for what happens on the platform.
You've both described this remarkable ecosystem that stretches from the government to this region. What could the nation do that would be really stupid that would break it? I guess I'm asking is how fragile is this ecosystem?
I mean, making it more difficult for smart people from all over the world to come and stay here is a good example.
Other things that the government role that they can play, knobs it can turn that it could turn in the wrong way as easily as it could turn in the right way?
Well, I think it's choosing where to invest. Right now, China took careful notes and looked at the American example, and China is doing the sort of public investment in higher education and advanced technology that the US was doing in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And the US has pulled back in many of those ways, including in higher education broadly defined at the state and the local level. And this is, state and the national level. And you know, I'm feeling this because I teach at a public university that is doing great by many metrics and has a fantastic computer science and engineering department, but also has been suffering, particularly in the last decade, just like all of public higher education, from severe funding cuts. And what state funding pays for is for undergraduate students to have affordable tuition, and for them to have, you know, teachers and TAs and undergraduate teaching. You know, the money that flows into from the private sector into universities, whether it be Stanford or Berkeley or UW, it goes to particular labs, it goes to buildings, it goes to particular programs. It's not necessarily going to pay for my TA in my history survey class. And that seems, I know this seems, you know, okay, what does this have to do with that? But when I look at the history of the massive expansion of higher education, particularly public higher education, and the opportunity, and the state of California, exhibit number one, this investment in higher ed in California, not only at Berkeley, not only at the flagship, but at all levels of the system, you see so many instances of kids who come from really modest means who become part of this economic miracle that is Silicon Valley, and that access is becoming harder and harder to do.
I also want to talk about something that Silicon Valley could do that I think would be bad, which is I think that it's important that there be a strong relationship between the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the Valley and the national security community, and I think it's problematic if a lot of people say, hey, we don't want anything to do with the Defense Department. And someone who is here in the audience and who's been doing a lot to build those bridges is Steve Blank. So he started a course at Stanford called Hacking for Defense, which is about getting graduate students to work on hard national security problems, hard problems in foreign policy. And that's a model that is now spreading to universities across the country. So I do think that there needs to be a stronger relationship between the folks who work on foreign policy and defense and national security and our innovators.
Well, given that, what do you say to the Google engineer who says, you know, I want to work on things for life, I don't want to work on weapons of death, and the evolution of the AI technologies is moving relentlessly to the ability to identify a single person and kill them from anywhere on the planet? I mean, I see your point. Where do they fit in?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's not unreasonable to have choice at the level of the individual employee. So I can see why like an individual employee would say, I don't want to work on this project. But to say, you know, our huge tech company, you know, we're not going to distinguish morally between the United States government and the PLA, I have a problem with that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. There's some really good questions here, but I want to ask you guys one more, because I really feel like if you look at, you know, China's industrial initiatives, telecom, Huawei, AI, you know, they want to catch and surpass by the middle of the next century. The Semiconductor 2025, where they want to catch the US and surpass, they want to play in the world as a semiconductor. That's all targeted right at Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. We went through this once upon a time with Japan. Is this different?
Yeah, it feels different. I think in part because China's about 10 times larger, number one. And number two, unlike in the Japanese situation where we're really allies on the foreign policy side, we are not allies with China. We have some real differences in terms of our national security interests. I think from a policy point of view, the thing that I don't have a good answer to is what do we do when for China money is no object, right? So the US political economy is based on the notion of being efficient in terms of the allocation of capital. So companies are evaluated on metrics like return on invested capital. Mm-hmm. And if what China cares about is national power, and they say in quantum computing, in supercomputing, in semiconductors, in AI, in 5G. Money is no object. They may piss away a huge amount of money. They may waste a lot of money, but they still may achieve their objective, which is leadership in technologies that are important for both economic growth and national security.
Yeah, and then there are some parallels there with Japan in the 80s where you have a lot of public investment and subsidy of industry. But it's very different, you're right. They're not, the US system is a product of internationalist democracy. And I think this is why it's so imperative, again, to recognize the history, that there is this long history of defense work. Part of the what's feeding some of this anger and bewilderment within companies like Google, that by employees who were promised, you promised me don't be evil, and all of a sudden this is not recognizing that there's been this long history and this long connection. But China can mimic Silicon Valley, and other places around the world can mimic it, but no other place can. Many places have tried to become a Silicon something, and no place has replicated that entrepreneurial flywheel. And I say Silicon Valley, people have said, well, you're talking about Seattle in this book too. And apologies to my friends in Seattle, but Seattle is part of the Silicon Valley ecosystem and is actually a driver of it too. So when I say Silicon Valley now, it's gone from a place in California, it's gone from this 100 square, this 10 by 10 patch of land, and now it is a global network. And so how do we take that sensibility, and how do we think about, particularly how does the place that gave birth to this industry think about what we do to shore it up and, again, preserve the free movement of people and capital, to the things that made Silicon Valley great that other geographies are not going to be able to do, and quite frankly, that it will be a very different world if it is a world in which Chinese tech companies are the biggest ones.
Yeah, I think the other interesting question is, I think that those people who were concerned about Japan sort of inevitably surpassing the United States technologically, I think, and I would put myself in that category as the impressionable 20-something listening to Andy Grove. But
that's a good reason. I would
it was this notion that that the future is going to be an extrapolation of what is currently going on, right? So if the United States is losing market share and Japan is gaining it, and the only thing that's different is the year when the crossover point occurred, then we assume that the future was going to be like the past, only more so. And I think what the Japanese would tell you is, they said, our goal was catching up to IBM, and we achieved that. By the time we had done that, that was no longer the most relevant thing to do. Mm-hmm. So the same sort of institutions that allow you to catch up are not necessarily the institutions that allow you to thrive when you are at the technological frontier and nobody knows anything, right? Mm-hmm. You don't know a priori what's going to be the next Amazon and what's going to be the next pets.com. And I remember,
both are in the book.
I remember a Microsoft executive saying, government shouldn't set standards, but there's one exception you could make, which is asynchronous transfer mode is clearly going to take over. And it's embraced by both the computer industry and the telecom industry. And that didn't turn out to be, right?
The visionaries are always wrong.
So,
yes.
It's like everyone took a pass on Star Wars. It's like that book about Hollywood, nobody knows anything.
So let's bring the audience in. There are actually some good questions here. You, Margaret, touched on watering holes in your book. Wagon Wheel, The Oasis come to mind. What's a favorite story you couldn't/didn't include about one of these places?
Oh, I'm gonna keep that. I gotta keep that in mind. Whoever asked that question, come talk to me after. DM me.
It clearly wasn't PG-13.
Nah, it was. What I did like was this, and I think that this took place at the Oasis, but again, there may be people in the room who were there and can elaborate further, that there were a lot of names that were riffed on for what Homebrew Computer Club might be called before they settled on Homebrew, like 2-bit byte bangers and Steam. There was one, the Steam Beer Club. I mean, it was nothing that memorable, as you can tell, because I don't know off the top of my head. But I love the idea of a bunch of guys sitting around at the O and eating burgers and drinking beer and back, what if we call it this? And they're like homebrew, and and a legend was born.
Yes.
I think, Margaret, that was an important part of your book, and the history of innovation is that a lot of things, before people do things for money, they do it because it's fun. They do it for love.
Yeah.
Yep.
Before they do it, before it gets done, before the suits come in and it starts
Before the
getting done for
suits
money.
come in, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also the argument that that's the ideal mix of a Silicon Valley company. One guy is doing it for fun and one guy who sees there's a market.
Yeah.
But having written, you sort of got at this, but I want to bring it back, because I think, having written the bio of Silicon Valley, how would you write the obituary of Silicon Valley? when would this be written, or will Silicon Valley be the phoenix in Harry Potter continually being reborn?
Well, it's defied its premature obituaries over and over. But look, I take the very long view. Yes, this will not reign forever. 100 years ago, Detroit was the most innovative city on the planet. Companies will come and go, industries will come and go. There will be a next something. I don't know if there'll be a next Silicon Valley ever, but there'll be a next something. And so the challenge and the question is, this is not, and again, the boom will not last forever. This is something that Silicon Valley knows very well and painfully, that a great boom is followed by a bust. And part of what makes it so great to be here, and the waves ride high, but then you have a low one after. So, what's left when whatever pops, and making sure that this place, as a community, still has enough enough there, and enough is welcoming enough of diverse functions and people that extend beyond tech.
You brought this up, but I think we probably can't bring it up enough, so I'm going to ask it again, and I want to put my own spin on it. The question is, how do you address the fact that even after all these years, Silicon Valley is still overwhelmingly white and male? Yes, we know this. Two questions. One, is it any different than any other part of the economy in America? Is it more or less misogynistic? I mean, that word does show up in your book, and that's different than the absence of diversity.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there were instances of misogyny in which people would say women couldn't do this. Like, you can't, this is a technical thing that women can't do. There are also many instances of male executives promoting women, of people not really factoring in gender. And sometimes being blind to gender actually was something that kept women from advancing, because of sort of this commitment to meritocracy, a belief that we're just a meritocracy that sometimes can make one feel like, well, it's all, we don't have the bias that we actually have. We all have bias. We all have our own prejudices and biases that we bring to any situation, and we try our best to overcome them. I think, yes, this is corporate America's problem. A lot of Silicon Valley's problem is just corporate America's problem. The C-suites have far too few women in them in any sector. I think what makes it the spotlight shine more brightly here is the contradiction between the meritocracy, the idea of what Silicon Valley presents itself to be, and the reality and the imbalance. It's a consequence, again, this is a place that grew out of a small, tight-knit group in industry. The electronics industry was, the people who were the technical people were almost, and the people who were making the decisions in the 50s and 60s were like the people making the decisions in any industry in the Mad Men era. They were almost entirely men. There were women in the companies, but they were not necessarily always given positions of authority, or if they did, they had to fight for them. That being said, I think when we enlarge the frame to look at non-technical people who have been really critical to the Valley's success, and this is something, this is an industry that privileges engineering. Like, that's the most important part of any org. But marketing is super important. Storytelling, PR is super important. A lot of these support functions that often are not valued highly, and particularly in some of these newer companies that are very engineering focused and where it's all about the product. Yeah, it's all about the product, but someone's got to take the product to market. Someone's got to find a customer base. And so that's where you saw more women, including more senior women in the industry, and continue to see them. And so I think part of when we enlarge the frame and look at the much larger cast of characters that makes the magic go in tech, then we see a more we see what it looks like to have a more diverse group of people in the room.
I think the other issue is the stakes are higher. So if you've got a situation with the Apple Watch, for example, where no women were involved in the development of the product, and they sort of forgot that women have periods, you have an understanding about why having diversity in terms of the design of products and services is important.
Yeah, it's good for business. It's like who's in the room asking the questions and deciding what the problem is to fix and how you fix it.
Okay. This is 2 questions, and one of them seems like a plug for me, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why did other universities that in the 1960s got substantial ARPA funding, University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, University of Utah, failed to become more like the Silicon Valley and Stanford and Cal? And then the second part is, did you read the Stuart Brand article in Rolling Stone about Park and early Silicon Valley?
Yes, I did. And you know what? There's a really great book that's being written about that right now. Well, why not? I mean, I think part of it is the public-private university problem. I mean, public universities are really special and really important because they do lots of things, and they sometimes have less flexibility to be like, we are going to re-engineer ourselves to serve the electronics industry, which is what happened at Terman-era Stanford to some degree. But also that it's not only the universities, it's the university working in synergy and synchronicity with a broader business community. The fact that this was, mostly orchards was an advantage for building this ecosystem, and also a spatial advantage. You didn't have, someone like John Sobrato or John Arriaga could go and offer a farmer a good deal for his land, and all of a sudden have many hundreds of acres to bulldoze over and put up tilt-ups. And that eased the lack of friction in the way that the Valley tech community could grow here is different than, even being in San Francisco, even being in Seattle, being in Salt Lake City. It's a different, it's part of what helps it. But I think understanding Stanford as a distinctive, as a unique institution whose leadership was doing things that no one else was doing. And this is not to say everyone should go do what Fred Terman did, because he also was a time and place that allowed this incredible opportunity to be taken advantage of. But that's part of, a lot of places around the world are like, oh, if we have a university, then this is our anchor for a tech cluster, which is totally true. You need that. But you also need other things too.
Yeah. We have one more assignment, I think, for Marguerite and the Exponential Center. I think you have to tell us a little bit about your one word. Now, Tom could only come up with 3 words, so he's off the hook, I think. But you did it. Did she just tell us their word and give us a little bit of the backstory?
Do I show the word as I tell it? Okay.
Okay, you have to show the word.
All right. Well, my word is not, I don't think it's going to be a huge surprise to everyone. History. So my one word I would tell a young entrepreneur is to look backwards as you're looking forwards, because the only way we understand the present and the only way you properly prepare for and build the future is to understand how we got here. And this is not something that is in fashion in the tech industry. This is something that is critical not just for tech, but for all industry. It's critical, I think, at this moment. We are, and history is not just important to learn, but also recognize that you are making history right now. That the textbooks 100 years from now are going to be talking about this place and this industry a lot. It is defining what not only the United States looks like now, but the world. So
no pressure.
No pressure. Do it right, guys. But learning from the past is not just fun names and dates and cool facts, although you do get a lot of cool stories in my book. But it helps you. People are really confused, both inside the industry and outside. They want to understand how this all works. And I hope I've helped us get a little closer to that understanding.
Thank you. You have an opportunity to get Margaret to sign the code. So thank you. Join me in giving her a hand. And Daniel, you want to come up and say